Hi, calling the Finance and Investment Committee of the Vallecitos Water District meeting to order on Tuesday, October 29th at 4 p.m. Director Martin and Director Sanella are both in attendance, along with a number of staff team members, and I'll turn it over to, I don't know, Glenn, if you have anything you want to kind of introduce?
Yeah, I'll take it. So the first item is the cost of service study. The board, I'm sorry, I will. That'll be part of this.
Part of this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I'm a good host.
Okay.
What I'm doing. My mama raised me right.
That's yours.
So the committee will remember that our previous cost of service study was for a 2-year period, and the last increase from that result, from that study, took place on January 1st of 2019. So we don't have the ability to do any additional increases to water and wastewater rates unless we go through another Prop 218 process. So our budget did assume, Mike, about a 3.5% increase on revenue.
3.5 to, yeah.
3.5 to 4 is around 3.5%. So into our budget for the current year and next, we assume that there will be some increased revenues through a new cost of service study. So we did retain Vallecitos, they're a consulting firm that does cost of service studies. And this is, at the end of the table is Todd Cristiano.
Hey, Todd.
So Todd, why don't you
Good
wait there?
afternoon.
So Todd's the lead for Vallecitos, and he's the one that's performing the cost of service study for us. And so I'm gonna turn it over to, I don't know if you're gonna say anything, Wes, or if I'm just gonna turn it over to Todd, but he's gonna walk you through basically an overview of the cost of service study process. And at the end of that, we're gonna pose a few questions to the finance committee to maybe help guide us as we move forward. And we'll talk about the next steps either as part of or at the end of Todd's presentation. The process is already underway, so Todd started his work. We've been giving him a lot of data, and they've been crunching a lot of numbers. Our rough plan is to initiate the next Prop 218 process probably in early January. That would be with a formal notice to the public, our customers, and that initiates a 45-day process. You have to give them a 45-day notice. So that would mean that in mid-February, we'd be considering rate increases at a public hearing. And if that goes according to plan, then March 1st would probably be our target date for rates to become effective. So, looks like you got a comment.
Did you have a question, Director Martin?
Yeah, I have a
This time?
question. Yeah, if maybe if Todd could just give us some of his references and other water districts, what his background is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
First day on the job.
Yeah.
Great. I've been in the industry about 20 years. I was a consultant for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. Then I went to work as the manager of rates at Denver Water and gave presentations like this regularly to the board. And I've been back in consulting since 2017. I'm chair of the AWWA Rates and Charges Committee. That's a committee that is in charge of updating, maintaining, and setting the standards for rate setting in the industry for municipal entities. We're also responsible for updating and improving the M1 manual of practice through AWWA. I also teach a financial management cost service seminar through American Water Works Association. It's next week in case any of you want to go. It's a 2.5-day course where we talk about the brutal details of cost allocation and peaking factors and all the stuff you want to know about cost of service. So, and like I said, I've been doing this about 20 years. So, majority of my clients are in the Rocky Mountain West. I have worked with a couple, working with San Diego and Vallecitos now in California. But a lot of cost service studies very similar to this in terms of developing models as well.
And before you were chosen by our staff, have you ever worked with Vallecitos before?
I have
or
not.
anyone related to Vallecitos, past or present?
I have not. Any other questions on?
Come on, jump in.
Great. Thanks for your time today. I have a presentation. I would say it's brief, but that always means you go long when you say brief. So I have a presentation here, talk about the rate study that we're doing. A couple of agenda items. We're going to talk about the goals and objectives of this study and what our basic scope of work is. You know, what are we doing for the district and what value are we trying to provide to the district. Talk a little bit about the rate study process in general and what part of the process we're focusing on. And the pricing objectives. This is an important component of whenever you look and do a cost service study and are looking at potential rate structure changes. instead of looking at rate structure changes in terms of, oh, we should do this or increase the service charge, it's more of we look at a higher level of pricing objectives. What do we want to achieve with the rate structure? That gives us information to inform what kind of alternatives can we come back to the board with. And after that, we're going to talk about milestones, deliverables, and that sort of thing in terms of getting the project to the adoption process.
And Todd, before you continue, I just want to clarify, this is for water only. We retained Raftellus to do the water cost of service. We're going to be performing the wastewater cost of service internally. Staff is doing that part. Water is much more complicated, and that's why we retained Raftellus. So everything you hear is related to the water side of things.
And one question is the objectives you spoke about. Where do they come from?
Based off the scope of work and the project approach and just our discussions over what we were trying to achieve, basically based off of some of the deliverables we need to have, which it's on the screen here, on this slide here.
So this would be staff and consultants' objectives, not necessarily the
Not necessarily
board.
the board, but it's they're all
Which
kind
is
of
the board.
overarching objectives that we want to do a cost of service study.
And going through the committee and the board process, that's when the board members will get opportunity to influence the study as it goes forward.
So these are some of the, I guess, basic objectives that we want to make sure that our rates are sufficient to recover your costs on an annual basis, at least for the period of time we're looking at, that they're legally defensible. We want to meet Prop 218. I mean, these are things that we kind of have to do for a rate study process. And develop a rate structure, review a rate structure that meets the pricing objectives of the district. If the objectives are no changes, there's no changes. So those are the kind of overarching objectives, and defensibility is obviously a big one here in California with Prop 218 and some recent legal cases. Our scope of work, basic cost of service analysis here. We're going to be looking at water consumption characteristics. Been working with Mike. He's provided a lot of great data so far. We had a meeting last week to kind of review our initial model and some of where the numbers are headed. We're going to develop the revenue requirement based off the fiscal year 20 budget, and we're going to evaluate the customer class cost to provide service based on the cost of service process we go through. And we're going to evaluate the current rate structure against pricing objectives that we'll talk about today and be getting feedback from this group today about pricing objectives. And we're going to develop a model for the district's use. They can take it and run with it after we develop it, put the finishing touches on it. Finally, we're going to attend some meetings, this finance committee meeting. We have a couple of board meetings we need to. Rate setting is basically a three-step process. We've got the financial plan, tells us what amount of revenue do we need to meet our annual expenditures. 2 is what's the developing the cost to provide service to the customer classes. And 3, rate design, which is how are we going to get the money? What's the balance of service charge or fixed charge versus volumetric rate? Our focus is here on the cost of service and the rate design component. We've been given a revenue requirement, which is the fiscal year 2019-20 budget, and we're developing our cost of service analysis and rates off of the fiscal year 19-20 budget. A cost of service analysis is kind of distill this down. It's a way to assign costs from your annual revenue requirement or those annual expenditures and capital expenditures you have. A way to assign those costs to the different customer classes, and I'll say customer classes, in this case, your customer classes are meter sizes for the most part. You have ag water and that sort of thing. Assigning those costs to those various customer classes based on the unique demand characteristics with each one of those classes. When you look at a 3/4 inch meter demand characteristics of customers that have a 3/4 inch meter, they have different demand characteristics than that, say, of someone who has a 3-inch meter. And when you look at these profiles, these demand characteristics of average day demands or peak day demands or peak hour demands, their demand curves look a little different. Those different types of demand curves place different types of burdens or costs on the system. So cost of service is a way to allocate your revenue requirement to these customer classes based on their proportionate share of the type of demand they place on the system. And some different components of that include average day demands. You look at the annual usage for a 3/4 inch meter class divided by 365, that's average day demands. Another one is peak day and peak hour demands, and we can estimate that for a customer class by looking at their peak month and looking at the peak demand period for the system. Peak hour is very similar. We have a number of customers within each of the classes, and the number of equivalent meters. So all those components help define the characteristics of a customer class. Again, 3/4 inch or 1 inch or 1.5 inch. And each one of those classes have some different characteristics. And the costs are assigned based on their relative share of the burden they place on the system. So to give you a quick example, when we look at costs associated with providing average day demand costs, and let's put aside how we do that, say there's some costs associated with meeting an average day demand for different customer classes. If the 3/4 inch meter represented 50% of the average day demands and a 3-inch meter represented 50% of the average day demands, they would be allocated 50% of the cost between those two. So it's all about proportionality. Rate design, this is the method of recovering the rates. We've assigned how much do we need to get from each customer class now. How are we going to recover it? What's the balance of the readiness to serve and the volume charge, and is it a tiered structure, is it a uniform structure, that sort of thing. So the district has a readiness to serve charge, which is based on meter size, and then has a volumetric rate, 3-tiered volumetric rate for the most part. And as the tiers increase, the thresholds increase, the unit prices increase. And so that's the current rate structure you have. And part of the pricing objective exercise today is to get your feedback on that rate structure and what are some important pricing objectives that the district needs to consider when looking at possible alternatives. And I say possible in that there may be nothing inherently askew with the current rate structure. But looking at some pricing objectives and talking about, well, these are the 3 key things we really want to make sure that we're doing with the rate structure. The existing rate structure might be meeting all 3 of those just fine. And we don't need to make any adjustments. So we'll go over that in just a second. So here's your current readiness to serve charges. Obviously increases by meter size. The multifamily is charged on a per unit basis plus whatever meter charge, whatever meter size they have as well. You've got a fire line that's charged on a per diameter basis, and a temporary construction meter as well. Very standard. Volumetric rates here, the top table shows the different thresholds for each of the meter sizes, and the thresholds vary by meter size because obviously larger meter sizes tend to have larger water use. So as you look down these various meter sizes, you can see tier 1, it's 1 to 6 units for a 3/4 inch, but it jumps to 1 to 430 units for a 3-inch. There's a lot more water usage occurring over the 3-inch meter size. And the tier 2 and tier 3. And this first row on the second table, commodity rate, shows the unit price for each tier threshold. So, for example, tier 1 on 3/4 inch meter, up to 6 units, you're charged $3.66. On that 7th unit, that 7th unit will be charged $4.60, so on and so forth.
Could you go back? Sorry,
Sure.
Chair. Non-participating agency.
Yeah, that should be ag.
That's ag non-participating, ag participating.
Yes.
So that's agricultural rates, and if they're participating, they're in the
Is
San
that
Diego County.
hidden for a reason?
I think
Sorry?
it just got cut off.
Yeah.
It's agricultural
for
rates.
for space, I think. I guess.
Yeah.
So what does it mean by ag participating agency?
So
That's all we're charging ag right now?
agricultural has a uniform rate of tier 2, which is $4.60. Those that are in the TSAR program, the transitionary, I forgot what it all stands for.
Conditional Special Agricultural Water Rate.
They get a discount, but that we are reimbursed from the water authority. So in terms of Vallecitos, we're still made whole. In essence, they're still paying $4.60 to us.
For those people that are in the program.
Yes.
Right.
Now what about those people that are not in the program?
Then they're that middle line right there. They just get $4.60. They pay $4.60 for their first unit of water. They pay $4.60 for their 99th unit of water.
And does that cover us?
That does, and that's one thing that the cost of service study will look at, just to make sure.
That it covers, okay.
Right.
Okay.
So we've had previous conversations and items at the policy committee where we've talked about the ag program. And right now it's kind of a closed society, and we've
Right.
considered should we allow more people into the ag program or not. And we kind of put a temporary hold on that pending this cost of service study. We want to figure out, do we want to continue with ag rates? Do we want to have irrigation rates? So we're not letting anybody else into the ag party at this point in time until we go through this process.
Okay, thank you.
So when we look at potential rate structure changes, we want to go through an exercise called pricing objectives, rather than throwing darts at the wall and say, well, we should have a 6-tiered structure, or we should be doing this. By looking at some pricing objectives in more general terms, it helps provide the boundaries or the guardrails of where we want to look at adjusting the rate structure or changing and that sort of thing. So this is the part of the conversation we would like feedback from this group on, in terms of, you know, what's important to the district in terms of the rate structure, what's important. And I'll just walk through some of these here, and we can talk through them.
Mr. Chairman,
Mhm.
a quick question. Just not that long ago, Mike, you've been around, we redid how we did it already. How was that, 2 years ago? So now we're looking at redoing that again?
Potentially.
Potentially.
There's no impetus to either go there or not go there, and that's what we're gonna be here for, is to get your feedback on that.
Well, the question is, if the way we're doing it is not correct, we need to change it. If it is correct, why are we looking at a second way of doing it?
I think you have to dispel the notion that there's correct or incorrect. There's different ways to do things, and they're not necessarily one more correct than the other. Every agency that goes through this asks themselves that fundamental question going through: do we want to keep the same general rate structure, or is there a reason to consider something else? So I think this is pretty routine. My advice would be, there needs to be a compelling reason to switch from the rate structure you have. Otherwise, it creates a lot of confusion with the customers.
I would think so, because we had to do a lot of explaining 2 years ago.
Right.
And it's like, so, I guess my question is, why are we even looking at alternatives unless we think there's a better way? There's every reason why you're going down this track, not just an exercise.
Yet right now, we haven't gone down that path, and that's why we wanted to touch base early with the finance committee to see, is that recommendation of the finance committee to even consider down that path? And then when we go to a board workshop, we'll ask a similar question to make sure, are we heading in the right direction?
Okay.
So there's some goals we obviously have. We obviously want rates that are gonna recover your cost. That's pretty standard now. So we want rates that are defensible. We're not gonna evaluate a rate structure or change that's not one of these two. So that's at least one boundary we have to operate in. And then we have all these other pricing objectives that they're kind of general in nature. They don't talk to a specific type of rate structure or a specific way to recover the cost, but it talks about it in terms of objectives. What's right for the district, what's right for the community that you serve. And we have all these here, and I'll walk through each one of these here, but as we go through, be thinking about the existing rate structure I just showed, and you know, I'm really interested in knowing more about this, and does our rate structure meet this particular objective? And so one thing we can at least do as part of this study is, based on some of the feedback we get from you in terms of objectives that are important, we can look to evaluate the existing rate structure and saying, hey, is it really meeting this objective, by looking at some qualitative but also some quantitative measures, and coming back to this group or the board and talking through those items. It's possible that there might be one objective that you might be interested in that the rate structure might be completely missing, that we might need to retool or make an adjustment. But we're not here to, what this is not designed to do is to determine what kind of structure change you're going to make. It's to determine, are we on track? Are we doing fine? Or is there something we need to evaluate? It really helps us.
Just a quick question regarding objectives. Other than kind of the greater objective of just balancing the budget, right? What are some examples, like, because to me there's a pool of money, right? And so if your objective is to go do something with this part of that pool, well, that's going to be made up somewhere else within the pool. So what are some examples as far as options of objectives that we might have other than balancing the budget?
That's what these objectives. So let me go through these objectives,
Sure.
and that might help answer your question. If not, we can circle back. So, like I mentioned, financial sufficiency and defensibility, those are two kind of, they're like almost throwaway objectives that we've got to have those. So if we had a rate structure today that was not recovering your costs, we need to fix that, first of all. That's an objective we have to have. So we're okay on these two. You know, we want to recover our costs, and it's defensible. It's got to meet Prop 218 and all the other state regulatory requirements, and anything else that the district might be measured against if somebody were to bring a case or a lawsuit.
And so have you reviewed our current rate structure for its defensibility, or are you not? Are you just, I don't know where you are in your process.
We've not gotten to that point yet.
Okay.
But I think when we get to at the end of this discussion in terms of the objectives, we're going to go back and look at defensibility. Our cost of service analysis will be able to tell us is there something really out of whack here that could have been called into question from the defensibility standpoint?
Because as Director Martin mentioned, we did do this 2 years ago, and I believe we might even have done it back in 2014 or 15. And so never once has, and we've had consultants and staff, and never once has anybody said this. What you're doing is not defensible, right? It's always been. I know we had a little bit of a wake up call with the was it Rancho?
San Juan Capistrano.
Yeah, San Juan Capistrano, where their tiered structures were called into question. But it just seems to me, it seems weird to me as a board member that in 2015 we went through a process and whatever we went with, we determined to be defensible. And then in 2017 we went through a slightly different structure, but it was, for lack of a better way to put it, sold to us that it was defensible. I'd be really disappointed to find out in 2019 that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if we're at that point right now, but it's going to be a pretty big surprise to me.
We're close to that point, and I wouldn't think that, barring some analysis that shows that there's one class or something, some sort of bizarre subsidy going on, that it wouldn't be defensible. But it's more of covering the bases and documenting that we've evaluated it. That's probably just as important.
It's good to have the third party
Just
look at
a
it.
quick follow-up to
Yeah.
Chairman Carlin said, does every water district do this every 2 years, or is there a problem there? We've
well,
done it two, and now it's like,
Yeah,
oh,
those-
you're gonna do another 2 years, another 2 years, I mean, is that normal?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of questions embedded in what you asked. All of
Yeah.
them go through a Prop 218 process, and each of them gets to determine the length of how long that's good for. And it has to be consistent with how you noticed it. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, and we want some feedback from the Finance Committee. So for example, you can just set 1-year rates, which was what we used to do. Last time we did this, we set 2-year rates, and now you'll have the option to go out as far as 5 years if you want, and that's as far as California law will allow you to go in a rate setting process.
Yes, the 218 process is not something that I'm questioning at all. It's, we're hiring a consultant every 2 years. So 2 years from now, we're gonna hire a
Well,
consultant again?
No.
We didn't have a
it was-
consultant for the last rate model.
That was
That's
done
part of the
internally.
reason, that's
Yeah.
part of the reason why we have a consultant for this rate model, is because the last rate model wasn't developed by a consultant and isn't user-friendly for the current staff.
It was designed by staff.
Thank you.
Internally. So, and our objective in here is we wanna, as Raftelis helps us to develop the model, we want Raftelis to train internal staff so that in the future, we could use the model that's developed for future cost of service studies. That's where we're heading.
Thank you.
The rate model developed by staff is not user friendly to staff?
Because it wasn't developed by the
Different
current
staff?
staff.
Different
Yes.
staff, oh, different staff, okay.
The person
I
who
gotcha.
developed it is no longer
Okay.
here, and he was the master of the.
I got you. Oh, so who was that?
Yes, the person is no longer here.
Okay.
So we've had one meeting where we've kind of reviewed the overall model framework and gotten some buy-in in certain areas, and we have some more flexibility and things to add in there to where in the future that I won't need to sit here, and staff's got the expertise to be able to move that forward.
But you already saw some things that can be tweaked.
I'm talking about just the model specifically, not the data in it, but in terms of the
Right.
user friendliness of the model, we've identified
Right.
some, maybe it's a different way to lay this out, make it a little bit more easy to understand and comprehensive.
And part of the things that might change year to year are user demands. So if user demands change drastically from one year to the next, that might be one thing that we tweak within the model. So it's not just changing the rate structure, it's just looking at what are the new norms of demand, because they've changed from 3, 4, 5 years ago. So that could be the only thing that changes, is that we say the tiers need to be collapsed, expanded, the amount of water that's in each tier. So it could be something as simple as that.
So we're changing the way we look at it, rather than using the Bangkok system, we're gonna use the Vallecitos system.
We're gonna use actual analytical data, which I love doing.
Thank you very much, Justin, you're a pro at it. Thank you.
Revenue stability, this is an important one. I have a slide, a couple of slides down that shows some revenue stability. Want to make sure your revenue stream is stable. Now, some utilities, they will forsake revenue stability for the sake of a better conservation signal or giving customers more power or ability to change their bill, meaning they put more of the emphasis on the volumetric charge rather than the service charge, to where they have more control over how much they want their bill. So revenue stability is a little different than revenue sufficiency. It's weathering those those high months in terms of if it happens to be a wet month in July and you don't earn your revenues, what kind of revenue stability do you want to have? And I'll share with you some revenue stability numbers, I guess, with current rate structure.
So that's a la SDG&E and Pacific.
I'm sorry?
That's what SDG&E has done with their smart meters.
Yeah. Possibly.
They put that in the consumer's hands to control when they use the electricity and therefore cut the cost. And we're looking at the same type of thing.
Not necessarily looking at that. It's a question.
Okay.
Do we have, so one of the questions I get from the public a lot of times is, or more of the gripes I get is that, especially for the senior citizen who lives by themselves, right? They say, well, I only, use a very little bit of water, but my bill, because of the fixed charge, $35, let's just say, I'll use a round number, it's there, 35, and maybe I have another $4 in the commodity cost. Do we have the flexibility to at least look at and consider lowering the fix and making and recovering that difference in the higher commodity? So if somebody is in those particular examples, they would have a lower fixed rate, but if they didn't use the water, then they didn't use it, but if they did, then they would pay whatever they used it for.
We certainly have the flexibility to look at things, and that's actually a pricing objective, is essentially use affordability. I'll get to that in just a second, and then we can talk about what are possibly some of the options, or how could we address that without being inequitable to other users, which is one of the Prop 218 things. Another one here is called interclass equity, and this is a fancy name of saying that the 3/4 inch meter costs are recovering their cost, the 1 inch meter costs are recovering their cost, and not 1 inch is kind of covering part of the tab of 3/4 inch, and 3/4 inch is kind of covering the tab of 1 inch meters. It's the equity between the customer classes. Each one of these customer classes are recovering their proportionate share of cost of service, so interclass equity. Intra-class equity is the equity between users within a class. So you think about a small user versus a large user, and how do we define and how do we recognize intra-class equity? And in this example here, that when you look at an individual customer basis, that the tiers, for the structure you have, the tiers are set that people using a lot less water are paying the cost to provide service to them, because they're not maybe peaking on the system. They're just low water users, very slow and steady. Their cost might be different than someone who's irrigating a lot in the summertime, and they're up in the third tier, placing a larger demand on the system, and so their average cost is going to be higher. So when looking at tiered structures, it's evaluating this equity between customers within a class, and there's some metrics we can look at in terms of analyzing whether the lower volume customers are paying their proportionate share versus the higher volume customers within a class. And that's in the cost of service analysis. Intergenerational equity is simply the equity between new customers and existing customers. And basically stated another way, if you're collecting impact fees to pay for growth, that offsets any sort of cost that existing customers have to pay. And have those fees been set at an appropriate level to where it places a minimum burden on the existing customers? We've not evaluated any sort of impact fee revenue or anything, but the fact that you have impact fees, you are demonstrating that you've got an intergenerational equity set up, meaning that growth is paying for growth and that the existing customers are paying their proportionate share.
And that's the process we just went through with the cap fees that the board adopted.
Conservation, obviously you have a tiered structure. You want to promote conservation like many other communities in California, and conservation-based price signal. When you look at a tiered structure, if you have a tiered structure, that might be great, but if the price for tier 1's $1 and the price for tier 3 is $1.20, there may not be much of a signal there. Again, through the cost of service process and looking at the costing of how customers use water, we can determine what would that third tier price be on a cost basis, and the second tier price. So if conservation is not important to the district, we could look at a uniform rate if that's not an important consideration. But conservation is obviously important to a lot of communities here. Demand management, this is another one here that there may be a need to reduce peak demands in the summertime because maybe you have a capacity issue at the plant, or that you have a water purchase agreement that in the summertime, that if you go over certain MGD, you get dinged with a penalty use charge or something. And I don't believe you have that here at the district, but in terms of demand management, if there's a benefit to reducing that summer demand, maybe not necessarily reducing the overall usage in a year, but reducing that demand such that you don't hit those peaks, you're not taxing the system at maximum capacity and maybe free up some capacity, that's another objective. Essential use affordability. How can we provide water service, essential water service, by looking at the people per household and the average gallons per capita per day? How can we provide that service at the lowest possible cost? That is called essential water usage. And we've had a few discussions about that so far, and there's maybe some challenges associated with that, because essential use affordability is really designed for a residential or single family type customer class. You have meter sizes. Now, majority of customers are, residential customers are 3/4 inch meters, so that works out nicely, but that'd be something we'd have to look at. And when we look at these pricing objectives and pick the ones that may be important to the district, like I said, it doesn't mean we're going back and changing the rate structure. We're going to look at the pricing objectives you selected and say, well, how do they measure up? You know, given some technical, quantitative, and qualitative analysis, bring that back to you and kind of get your thoughts on that, and then where do we need to move from there? Customer understanding. Obviously, you want a rate structure that people can understand. You don't want a lot of phone calls coming to the call center saying, I don't get this, it doesn't make any sense. Impacts on customers. We had talked about a transition or doing cost service for a 5-year period. If you were to make rate structure changes, but you didn't want to have significant impact on customer bills, there's a way you can transition the rate structure to those changes over time so you can minimize the impact on customers. You're not taking all the hit at once. So, for example, if you're going to, let's say you want to increase the fixed charge by an additional $10, you could do it in 1 year maybe, or you could transition that over a couple of years. Still recover your total revenue requirement each year, but you're just slowly transitioning that into that higher fixed charge over time. Just an example. Ease of implementation. This is usually a critical thing behind the scenes, that we have to be able to put this into our system and be able to bill it, and without any major overhauls. You might come up with the greatest rate structure in the world, but if you can't send a bill on it, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's no silver bullet rate structure. There can always be tweaks. In my time at Denver Water, I learned that if it's not broke, don't fix it. But what's important, I think, is by having this discussion of pricing objectives, kind of gives us a little bit of these guardrails of where we need to be looking at, and deciding, there's really not many options that would enhance the current rate structure based on some of these objectives here. Or there might be 1 or 2 things that, let's look at this and see where it takes us, and find out whether there's a need to evaluate further. So those are the pricing objectives. And I'm going to come back to those in just a second. So there's obviously a lot of competing objectives here: revenue stability versus conservation pricing signal. If you wanted to have a really steep multi-tiered rate structure with those higher tiers at a really high price, if you have a wet year, you're going to lose all that revenue, so you're going to have some instability. But if you want to have a high fixed charge for revenue stability, you kind of lose that conservation pricing signal. So there's some balancing here. This is where the art and the science comes into rate setting. Revenue stability versus interclass equity, very similar situation. You have these tiers versus trying to get more revenue from the fixed charge. Customer understanding versus interclass and interclass equity. Just making sure that the costs that people are charged in different classes make sense relative to the other customer classes, and that you're equitably recovering that. Essential use affordability versus intra-class equity, customer within class. And you kind of alluded to that a little bit with what can we do to ensure that if we provide some sort of essential use affordability rate option structure, that how's that going to impact the other customers within that class? And because we've got meter sizes, how might it affect the inter-class equity of those customer classes? So just switching gears real quick. So as we think about those pricing objectives, and I want to have a discussion about that. Switching over to one slide I wanted to show you here. This is an example pie chart of where the district receives its revenue, and there's 4 components to it: the readiness to serve charge, which is the fixed charge by meter size. the tier 1 volume rate, the tier 2 volume revenue, and the tier 3. And the ag water and all that is in the tier 2. But what I want to show here is that the readiness to serve charge, you get about 32% from the fixed charge.
These are our actual numbers.
Yes.
Okay.
You get about 32%. You know, the average is around 15 to 20% industry-wide. But you also have to consider that, you know, you've got a fairly stable revenue stream in that block 1 revenue you're getting. There's not going to be a lot of, if there's a huge wet month or something, you're not going to lose a lot of that tier 1 revenue. So when you look at your total fixed charge or revenue stability, you really need to consider this 32% and 17% as being kind of your fixed charge component. So this asks the question about the essential use affordability. You know, is there a way that, based on cost service analysis, that, you know, maybe we don't need to recover 32% from the readiness to serve charge, and maybe there's a balancing act there we can look at in cost service in terms of demands and the cost we need to recover in a readiness to serve. So this would be something in terms of a pricing objective. If essential use affordability was important, we could look at some parameters associated with what are some of the things you need to consider when designing or looking at updating or changing your existing rate structure. What would need to happen? And there might be some things that require a lot of restructuring and just a lot of work, to where maybe there's something else we can do. Maybe there's we can do a customer assistance program instead of a low income or essential use affordability. So some considerations that we have just talked about. We've just thrown this around. There's been no decisions on this, and just some ideas that have been tossed around, and just kind of getting a little bit ahead of the pricing objectives. But things that we've talked about, and depending on the pricing objectives we talk about today, will help us inform, do some of these not really meet any of the objectives that we really want to have that's right for our rate structure? You know, adding a 4th tier. There's some concerns about the rate in that 3rd tier. There's a way to bring the other tiers down based on having a 4th tier. Creating a separate irrigation class. They have a really different demand component than some of those other meter size classes, because they only have summer usage. So that might meet a particular objective. Pass-through cost, the district purchases their water, and sometimes there's increases to those pass-through costs that you have no control over. And is it fair for the district to kind of have to try to absorb that in the rate structure and then be asked about why to go up 5%, and then looking over at San Diego County saying, well, they raised their rates 10%. A pass-through might be shown as a line item on the bill, and as that goes up and down, that just changes, and it's a little more transparent in terms of where the increases are coming from. Essential use affordability, we talked about that. And cost service terms, this is, we can set up the model for a cost service that's 1 year just for next year, or we can look at a 2 or 3 or up to a 5-year cost of service, to where in the model, based on the budget that's been entered in, we can project out what the cost of service is going to be over the next 5-year period. And if there are changes to the rate structure and you want to transition those over time, doing that 5-year look ahead is maybe a good way to do that. So these are just some of the things we've batted around. I'll say, you know, nothing else more than that. We're just kind of batted around. But I think what we're looking from this group today is really, when you think about those pricing objectives, what's important to the district meeting the district's goals and community goals? I might throw in that, well, conservation is obviously important. You have a tiered structure. And so if we can get some feedback in terms of those goals, that'll help us inform what kind of changes we might need to make here, what kind of changes we might need to bring back, if any at all.
That's it?
Yeah, so,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that those, you know, those are just examples, and those aren't mutually exclusive. You can say, we want to do all of those things, and, you know, we want to answer that to each of those as we go through this process.
And you probably have a few more that you'll bring up in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
We have
So
workshops.
definitely have.
We never
a
even
couple
into
of
that.
I first off, great presentation, and that it was very informative and helpful. And I'm fascinated by all of it, and I think that there's some possibilities that we can do things, I say, differently. Hopefully there's a way to make things even better, whatever better means. But I also what I'm cautious about jumping into this even right now is that we're just about into November. Holidays are going to start coming up. It sounds like there's two separate things that we're talking about. Do we need to do a 218 process to change rates? One way, you either leave them the same, raise them, whatever it might be, to meet our revenue needs for 2020, and then there's this whole other thing here. And so I'm looking at those as two separate things. I think it would be, I'm not even, this has been great. This is a lot of information to digest, but I'm not prepared to give you guys really good information as to which of those objectives are most important to me right now. And I'm afraid that if we try to combine both of those two categories that I just mentioned, and do them together and meet that time frame that you're talking about of having something by January and ready to roll by March, I think we're going to be moving too quickly on this piece of it. What I think this would be, because I really am sincerely fascinated by this, and I want to really dive deep into it, but I think this should be one of our 2020 board goals, is to spend the entire, maybe not the entire year, but 9 months, 10 months of next year, really, getting public comment, having workshops, giving all of the board members an opportunity to really get a good, deep understanding of what all the different objectives mean, and really take our time at this, and then have something ready to go for 2021. And that would be my initial feedback, because I think this is just too much to chew over the next 45, 90 days, if we combine the two.
I would kind of echo a lot of that. It's what's the rush to judgment? If we're not doing it correctly now, we need to make sure that we're going to be doing it correctly in the future. If we're not, don't know if we are or we're not. But there's no big rush on this. A year's delay is not going to, the buildings aren't going to go empty. We're not going to have to put the air conditioning to normal. We're not going to have to turn off lights. I mean, it's like there's suddenly a rush now. It's like, why are we trying to rush it through? There's a lot of information here that we need to make a good decision. I think the whole board needs, but I know I need. Every one of those, or 2 or 3 of those, could be a full class day's meeting to go through every 1, 2 of those objectives there. So to say that we're going to do this, I agree we should do it. We need to do it right, and I don't think by rushing it, it's going to help us get it right.
The timetable that you presented when you kicked us off just seems like, I understand why we need to do that for our revenue needs for next year. I'm not quite understanding why we need to have the same timetable for this. And I would like to see this be one of our goals. I mean, I'm just one of 5 board members, but I think this is the kind of the time of the year where we start talking about kind of goals for the following year, right? So this would be a good one.
Yeah, so they are certainly tied together. As we mentioned at the beginning, our budget did include assumptions of revenue increase. So the structure around that. If we don't do that, we could provide the board with an estimate of how much revenue we would be losing, so that would show the shortfall.
Be losing for what? For not doing this?
Yeah, well, if we didn't do a cost of service and we didn't do the Prop 218, we are tied into the rates we have today.
Yeah, no, yeah, that I understand.
So in our budget, I think we assumed, was it full 6 months of increased revenue?
Yeah.
When we did the budget, we assumed the new rates would go into effect on January 1. Just the process is taking a little longer, so we're thinking it's now going to be March 1, so we're already going to be a little behind. But we could provide an estimate of how much less revenue we would bring in if we deferred.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit of a different discussion, and I would like to see that information, because as we've talked about in prior meetings, when we look at our current reserves and our floor and our ceiling, if I remember correctly, we're teetering towards the very tip top of that ceiling, and there could be an opportunity to do some stabilization through our reserves, and I certainly want to see all that data. But unless there's something that's glaring that this current structure that we have is not defensible, and we're at risk for some reason because of it, why can't we, for this year, in addition to looking at what we just talked about, doing nothing, and I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I think it's something we should at least look at, but why can't we use the current structure and say, based off of our revenue needs,
Oh, okay.
what would it, if we just stayed with the current structure, what would the increase be per the tiers and per the fixed
For
cost?
example, if we thought we needed, if we budgeted for a 3.5% revenue increase, why not just take all the tiers and increase them by 3.5%? Take all
Well,
the fixed
maybe,
tiers, is that
or
what you're
to-
suggesting?
Yeah, or, you know, in some way, shape or form, yes.
And that would
Maybe,
be
maybe
one-
tier 1 doesn't go up 3.5, but tier 2 goes up 4, and, you know,
See, when you,
whatever.
when you start doing that, I think that's when you're gonna start running into problems with defensibility.
Okay.
And
Well,
if
then
somebody
that-
challenges you, they're gonna say, how, that seemed arbitrary, as opposed to saying, hey, we took the old model and just grew the size of the pie. I think that'd be more defensible, that you spread the cost.
Maybe
in
for
the
1
same
year,
fashion.
because I really sincerely am interested in this. I just
Yeah.
don't want to rush it.
Well, this was a broad presentation and it covers a lot of information, gives you like an overview of everything, but this is a 2.5, 3 month timetable that we have, and just for doing a water rate structure, it's very doable. And not to mention, we've actually contracted Raftellus to perform a cost of service study. So anyway we look at it, we have to pay them that contract cost. So if we don't do it, we've wasted that
And it
money.
may be doable for the staff to do. That's not the problem.
Oh, no.
The problem is for the board to wrap its mind around all these changes that we
There's-
could need,
Yeah.
but we might not need. So right now, best case scenario, March 1st. And I know we've talked about this in the past, January 1st is the best time to do it, new year. So what's it gonna cost to put it off, delay it 9 months?
We'd basically lose this contract, have to recontract it probably, and it would just be a.
Well, that's okay. I mean, well, what's it gonna cost? What's the overall
Well,
cost?
I think based on, with the given schedule, the number of meetings, everything that we have planned, I think we could inform the board, give them all the details they need. Once we can start getting into the workings of the rate model, I don't think it'll be too much to grasp or to present to the committee and to the board in a 4 months process.
We were planning a couple of board workshops, because we knew that this, we wanted to get feedback from the finance committee.
We were
and-
planning on doing this before the end of this year. That's what we were planning on doing. Last we talked about it at the beginning of last year.
We had a February 1 implementation, so now
Yeah.
we postponed it to
It's
March.
1 month, yeah, 1 month delay.
To give the board
No,
more
you had a
time,
February 1 when, what point in time?
when we contracted Raftellus.
Yeah.
Okay, but I'm saying prior to that, prior to contracting, I don't know, I just know what we talked about. Was that, yeah, we're gonna do it, we're gonna keep it out of the election cycle, so we're gonna keep it out of 2020. And now it's in 2020.
For me, it's a little bit different. I think there's going to be a huge learning curve for the board to wrap their head around what we just discussed in the last 10, 15 minutes. And then I think it's also important to hear and give our customers an opportunity to come to the workshops and educate them on some of the things that we're talking about, but also get their feedback and what some of the things that they like about what we're talking about, what they don't like about what we're talking about, and what maybe there's something that we the board aren't even thinking about, but they might bring it up in discussion, and our team of experts here can go and kind of see what we can do with that feedback. So I just think this is a process, and I'm not saying that we can't, and maybe there's some value out of this study that we've already paid for, that to tell us that we're okay with our current structure as far as defensibility. I think that's important. It's always good to get a third set of eyes to look at that and a third party opinion on that. And then also they can start working on some different options, but I understand if we don't give them the direction, then it's hard for them, it's hard for them to even start to even compile all that stuff. And I think there's a lot of stuff that has to happen before we're ready to give good direction.
It would be nice to not have to do this every 2 years, and not have to hire a consultant every 2 years. We're gonna rush to judgment, we don't really need to. There's no real need there, lights aren't being turned off. Just add people alone. I mean, I think they will show up and force it, we let them know we're looking at raising their rates. But they need to understand as well as we do we wanna continue subsidizing ag? If so, do we wanna subsidize Soapy Joe's Car Wash? Do we wanna subsidize the washing and drying operations? I mean, so there's a lot of questions that need to be asked and answered. If you wanna get this right, you can't rush to justice, in my opinion.
If I may, so
It's all-
just real quick, I totally respect what you're saying. In terms of the subsidy, if we were to create an irrigation rate, if we were to create the ag rate, there would be no subsidy. The cost of service study in itself, as Todd mentioned, would look at that class and what is the cost to providing service to ag customers. And they're like their own strata. They're their own little separate thing. If it costs, and I'm just going to throw a weird number out there, if it costs $10 million to provide service to ag customers, we need to receive $10 million in revenue from ag customers. Now that amount's way high, but I just wanted to
Right.
tell you that. So that's what a cost of service study does. It makes sure that each customer class pays for their respective costs. My personal opinion with this whole study, and I don't like to jump to the end without analyzing data. I analyze data all the time. I don't like to come to a conclusion first. But my initial suspect is that there's not going to be many changes. That because of change in demand patterns, my initial assumption is we may see some tweaks in tiers. So, and mainly for the little bit higher tiers. I don't see really any change, it's my personal opinion just from looking at the data, in single family residence too much. I see a lot of the change in the 3, 4, 6 inch and 10 inch meters, because now that we have the data and we have at least 3 years that are provided to Todd, and we can go back further, we see that there is a change in demand patterns that we didn't recognize when the last cost of service study was done. So that's where I see some tweaks. Some of these other ideas are just ideas that we could think about doing. We used to have 4 tiers. Doesn't make sense. That was actually my idea. Talking with Todd, he's like, your 3-tier structure works. But I thought, what if we did do a 4th tier? I'd like to look at that. And regardless of whether we go there or not, I'm the type of analyst that I need to prove that something doesn't work as well as something does work. So that's something that I would probably look at on my own. A lot of these other things are, they're already incorporated into our model. The one big change would be putting pass-through costs on. And that would just be saying if SDG&E raised their rates 5%, it's an exact 5% pass-through on SDG&E. So my recommendation, and again, it's not my choice, but my recommendation would be to go through with the cost of service study, see what it says. If at any point it comes to a hiccup, the board absolutely has, hey, stop at that point. And so that's what I would recommend, is that we just go through, we won't make any decisions. I like to see where does the numbers tell us. We don't know where we're going if we don't know where we're going, if that makes sense. So I like to see where the numbers, throw them in a spreadsheet, have Todd spit them out and see where we are. And like you said, maybe we're not off track. Maybe it just means moving, and one of the things I see is our 3-inch meters are a little bit offline. I know that. Is that we might have to move the tiers on them and actually contract the tiers on the 3-inch meter. The data shows that. The data might show something else. So I would recommend that we go ahead and do that, bring it back to you guys, and at that point you say, okay, I need more information on here, I need more information on here. That makes sense. I don't understand.
Yes. Completing the cost of service study does not commit the board to going through with a Prop 218 process.
I understand, but and I'm even okay if you want to go through that kind of blindly. But if you're asking us for what our guidance is as it pertains to the objectives, I'm intrigued by a 4th tier. I don't know if it's good or bad or not, but I'm definitely interested in hearing about it. I'm interested in seeing what we might be able to do around our ready to serve cost, our fixed cost. I mean, I want to see a little bit of all of it, and that's where I'm saying is that that's not fair to Todd and you guys to say, give me every possible option out there, right? And so I think we might have gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves and should have maybe had a meeting, and maybe we did, and I either missed it or forgot about it, which happens sometimes. But but maybe we should have had a little bit of a like, I don't know. I mean, I'm fascinated by all this sincerely, and I don't think that we're going to be able to accomplish this, especially with all the holidays coming up and everything. I want to hear I want to give the public an opportunity to chime in on this, and we can go. I mean, if we're paying for the cost of service study, we might as well have a cost of service study. But I don't feel like I'm going to be able to give you guys really good guidance. Other than I'm fascinated by it all.
Yes.
So, like Director Martin said, we're not going to make. I don't think, and Mike hit on it too. I don't think we're going to make any major changes to our rate structure. So while we will look at all of the.
But why not? What if we do? What if we go through this and we're like, hey, we're gonna cut our ready to serve costs in half?
If we did that during the process.
I'm not saying we are, but I'm just saying
No.
that was presented as a
And
possibility.
if we got into the process and we started presenting things and the board said, hey, we want to make major changes, we can always delay it and then, you know, extend the contract possibly, go into future months, do something like that. But I think it's a good idea to proceed with what we're doing currently, bring it to the board, see what they say, and if you say as a board, if you decide to extend it, we can always do that later. We don't have to sort of halt the process and restart it later on.
Yeah, next one.
And remember, we are gonna have 2 workshops, and the workshops aren't just to bring the understanding level of the entire board up, it's to provide opportunities for the public. So that opportunity for the public to come in and provide feedback is part of the workshop process.
And not to say that this stuff's easy. We've done a lot of analysis already, but some of this stuff is, once the data's already in that database, my 250,000 lines of data, which actually is 270 now, it's relatively easy to do some of these different things. And yes, we don't want to go down too far and then have to backtrack, but some of these things are easy to model once that data's already in there.
And while this is the kickoff meeting, we are kind of mid-contract with this, in that we've provided them with all the information requested to date. So at this point, it's pretty much taking the initial model, populating it, and then working forward. So we've already got into the, you know, with board approval, we signed the contract and got into it, and we're mid-contract.
And I don't disagree with any of what you're saying, except that you're really putting everybody under the gun here to come up with answers for you, including the board. We need an answer by this date
And
in order to make this happen.
well, I think we can find out when we bring it to you if we're really putting it under the gun. Because I think this, since they have all the information, these are pretty standard models and making changes. It's not a whole lot of work or that time consuming. It is time consuming, but it's not, we have months to go through this in many meetings. If we bring it to the meeting and you say, you know what, we don't have enough time, we can always delay it at that point. But why would we consider doing it now when we haven't seen any numbers or any information yet?
I don't think that's, what I was saying was that it might not necessarily take that long. But I want staff to be prepared that it may take that long.
Oh, yeah.
If you want good decisions from your
Absolutely.
board,
Yeah.
you gotta expect some of the board members are gonna be asking a lot of questions. We've done this 3 times, I've been involved 3 times, and now it's the 4th time, and it's like, I've only been here 8 years. And how do we stop from having to do this every 2 years?
Right, exactly.
And hire a consultant every 2 years? It's get it right.
Yeah.
And I know that's what you wanna do.
And we are-
And
you
all I'm
can't-
saying is don't
yes.
put getting it right on a time clock. It may work out to be that time clock, but it may not.
Right.
But I want staff to get there in a bunch if it doesn't happen.
That's always up to the board, so I wouldn't do that. And we're always willing to work hard to put the time in, and if we need to extend that time, it's the board's decision, and we're willing to do that.
I don't want the committee to think we're doing this because we got it wrong before. It wasn't wrong before. You have to go through this process after a period of time. The last one we approved a 2-year process. And we can't increase the rates again without going through another process. And that new process will determine how long that process lasts for. We may choose to do another 2-year rate increase, but our rates are frozen where they are right now without going through that next process. And our budget assumed an increase. So that's the kind of a disconnect from between the rates and the budget that we're going through the process would help
And you
reconcile.
assumed a 3.5% increase in water?
That's it was 3.5 to 4%.
3.75.
That's the number that went through the budget process, and the board approved the budget, knowing that there was rate increases coming, and at the time, we thought it
Potential.
was, well, no. The revenue requirement was gonna go up by 3.8% as approved in the budget. Well, not potentially, that's what we planned on, that's the budget document that was approved by the board, with the understanding that that increased revenue would become via a Prop 218 cost of service study
Or
process.
through some sort of rate stabilization or reserves.
Possible. Yeah, you can view that as your revenue increase if you're gonna say, hey, we're gonna take money out of reserves to augment the operating budget.
And that's something that we've talked about. I mean, we've looked at, we have a floor and a ceiling, we're right at the ceiling. So at some point, do we wanna manage that reserve to, you know, closer to the middle of between the floor and the ceiling, or do we wanna be at the ceiling, like we are today?
Well, that's based on the rating criteria too, so we have to keep the data.
No, I
cash
understand.
where we
I
need it.
know.
Then we haven't actually paid for the PERS yet either. That's one thing we'll be talking about today.
You'll talk about that in the next
So
item.
Those are all things we gotta
Still
consider.
okay with PERS?
We'll be sending an $8 million wire here.
So I do agree with you. I feel bad because I don't think we're gonna give you good direction to go forth with, but I go forth. I mean, you have Todd on. let's see what you guys come up, give us all the different options that you can think of. I mean, I'm even kind of curious about like what would a non-tiered approach look like. I mean, I really am fascinated by all of it.
Yeah, there's an agency, Valley Center does that. They don't have any tiered rates. It's all a flat rate. So,
Let me ask you, I don't wanna know your specifics on contracts, but does your contract call for an extension? If an extension is needed?
No, but we could always renegotiate with
Yeah.
Valley if necessary.
He looks like a reasonable guy.
Yeah. Will you accept more money if we need you longer?
Negotiations over.
Yeah.
He's a gun for hire, that's what he is, you know what I mean? It's something, okay, because you brought that up, oh, we have to renegotiate a big contract, it's a big deal, it's like, really?
Well, no, we can, like I said, if we move forward with this and we decide we want to extend it, it's up to the board, we can always do that if necessary.
Well, I'd like to go through all those options and all the things that we talked about at the next meeting, one or two at a time, and go through them and find out, because it is
So
interesting.
we need a deeper dive for sure.
I think what we need to do though, in order to do that, we need a basis, we need a starting point. So what I would like Todd to do is build the cost of service study as if there was gonna be no structure change at all. And what does that mean? Because without a starting point,
Sure.
we don't know where to go.
That makes sense.
So I'd at least like to get started and dive headfirst into no change in structure, but let the costs fall as they
Yeah.
may.
Mhm.
And
That-
what does that
that's
mean? Does
yeah.
it mean a 20% increase? We don't know that. It's not going to, but we don't know that.
Well,
So until we know that, we have no place to start.
shouldn't
So-
it be around 3.5? or
It
so?
should be,
Should be.
should be chasing the revenue requirement.
Right.
No, I thought it was a 3.5 decrease,
Yeah.
that's what I think it is.
As we're doing that cost of service, thinking about those pricing objectives to help inform which of those options we just looked at, the fourth tier and all that, would be helpful. So we can talk in terms of pricing objectives, we can do the cost of service analysis, come
I
back.
think the
here's-
fourth tier has a lot of merit, to be honest, that's my personal thought.
I'd like to see it.
in terms of what's the basis? What is that
If we
trying
like the
to
person.
accomplish?
Well,
And
that's where,
the question we-
yeah, well, so that's where the deeper dive really needs to take
Yeah.
place, because if you add the fourth tier, what, again, and I don't know what parameters we're allowed to work within, but if we're able to have tier one, even lower tier one to have that essential rate, right? And it's captured somewhere else, and you kind of spread that cost through the three other tiers, does it, it's kind of smooth the pain, if you will? And again, I don't know, is that even legal? I have no idea.
So that might be a conservation pricing objective of having that
It could
fourth
be.
tier plus meeting an essential use affordability
Yeah.
objective. So that's just the way that I'm thinking about it, but, I mean, those are certainly things, we get the basic cost service set up, then we can move from there based on that type of discussion.
And I'm gonna have a pretty interesting question, something that one of our, people bring up all the time, apartments. On a 2-inch, 3-inch, what are they on?
2-inch.
On a 2-inch, are they paying their fair share for the amount of water they use? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, cause you consider all the hookups, they're ready to surcharge the right amount, cause instead of having, individual families of, 80 in the apartment complex, paying $55 times 80, you have one person paying $600, or whatever the number is.
Based on our current model, they are paying their fair share. And our current model is not, again, I wouldn't say it's a bad model or it's not defense. It's not indefensible.
Well, I'd like that to be shown, because that's a question I've always had as well.
Well, and
And I'm an apartment dwelling myself, but I'm always interested in knowing, are they really paying their fair share? I don't know the answer.
But I think
I'd
we
like to
could,
get it.
I think we could have an hour discussion just on the fourth tier piece. And that's what I'm trying to talk about when I say deep dive. I mean, so, all the different ways that when you add a fourth tier, I mean, I would imagine there's a lot of ways you can kind of move those numbers around and see what that looks like. And if you do this, then what happens here? And if you do that, then what happens there? And I really think that's the kind of deep dive that we need for this. Now, I understand that we can do I think Mike's got a good point. Let's get the cost of service study done, make sure double, triple check that we're defensible, and based off of the way that the structure is today, what would the numbers be based off our budgetary needs? And then we can have the follow-up conversation after that of, do we wanna take anything from reserves to kind of smooth that down a little bit? But that's a third separate conversation.
yeah, that's more the rate setting process.
Yeah.
But as
And
far as
the
the
tier 4, I would have a question as to what customers are affected by that?
Well, it could be,
One of your many numbers can
it
tell
could be,
us that.
it could be one of them, or it could be all of them.
I know, that's what I'm
Yeah,
asking,
so-
which type of customer is most using the tier 3, well over the tier 3 now, they go into a tier 4 status?
And again, it
What
all has to
kind
go
of,
back.
like ag?
It all had to go back to cost of service. I mean, the actual definition of cost of service. You couldn't just give a tier 1 to residential customers
Okay.
and ignore everybody else. That would be against cost of service. You would not be defensible. So
And out of curiosity, we have several washer dryer locations around town, their businesses, they pay a different amount
In the commercial.
than a regular commercial. Because a regular commercial, you know, the guy at the auto store doesn't use a whole lot of water as compared to a washer dryer. Is there a different fee?
they would pay depending on their meter size. So if they're a 1-inch meter,
And it would probably be a meter size to the entire complex.
correct.
If they're in a strip mall of 10 units.
And if they're using a lot of water, they probably hit tier 3, so they're probably paying that $8.87 per unit. So
The whole group is, because they're not sub-metered, they're not gonna
Right.
be. But,
so that's the
so,
downside to some customers undersizing their meters, that they're going to hit tier 3 a lot quicker.
but they're the ones that are abusing the water. Or their business is relying upon our water, as the ags are. They're relying upon our water, and it's like, what was the cost of that? So, okay, so I'd like to delve into individual usage. And I think some districts do. It makes a difference whether you're an auto parts store or a washer dryer place, you know, that has 100 running all the time. It's not the same commercial.
So I think part of the issue is that we haven't done any of the legwork yet, and we don't have anything to show you to give you examples of this stuff.
Oh, you got plenty of time to do the legwork.
Oh, and we will, and that's what we'll do. And when we do that and we bring you the examples, we'll answer a lot of your questions, and I think that you'll see that this will be a
Smooth
good
process.
process.
But I don't want anybody to think we're gonna be able to develop a structure that's gonna account for every perceived inequity. You know, if you're gonna be comparing a laundromat with a car wash with something else, any rate structure, you're gonna be able to say, is that fair? There's no right answer to this, it just has to be defensible. So I'm concerned that you were looking for perfection and it doesn't exist. You can't have a rate structure for every type of business.
And that's why 2 years ago we did go through the process, and the actual last person that did it actually did a very good job in showing that we are better off going by meter size versus customer class. So for your example, all commercial customers, if all commercial customers were treated equal, then that laundry person and that mom and pop place would be on the same level. Now it's, if you have a 2-inch meter, your 2-inch meter is designed to handle, and I'm sorry, I'm not engineering, but so many flow.
Yeah, uh-huh.
So whether you're a 2-inch meter washer dryer or 2-inch meter whatever, you're treated the same because you have the same type of meter. So the analysis at that time did show a very good correlation with meter size, and that's why I don't think that this cost of service study is going to show a great need for a change. It was very well done because I did part of the work, but it was very well done, that part.
You and your computer.
He did that part of the work.
I
yeah.
did
By the
do
way,
that part of the work.
congratulations for getting a sign it next to your door.
Thank you.
Yeah, with his title on.
That only took.
My
what,
mom
a
always
year?
said I'd be somebody.
A year, 2 years?
Now you
5
5 years? to
5
get
years
the
without
sign?
signing.
Alright, so you guys crystal clear? on
Crystal
what you
clear,
want?
crystal
Okay.
clear. Look at Todd, he's chomping at the bit, ready to dive in now.
Sounds
We
good.
have a speaker, I know, Mr.
Oh, yeah, and we do have one speaker.
Todd's going, can we renegotiate
Yeah.
that?
Okay, so,
Okay. For the record, Mike Hunsaker, President of Twin Oaks Valley Property Owners Association and a self-styled citizen advocate. I'm also part of a lawsuit against a new large development in the Sierra. And I'm also a participant in a lawsuit in San Diego. And water in 218 matters. I see, didn't want to hear that, but you will. There are two, I've made a list of different Prop 218 issues that need to be addressed. And I'm not gonna go through 35 of them right here. But I am gonna point out a couple of, just 2 examples that need to be addressed. One of them is fire. and the other one is lease capacity. Now on fire, on 2010, the state fire departments, CAL FIRE, specified they need to increase water capacity flows for new developments, new houses. And in 2011, the state mandated that we would have to require all homes go from 25 gallons per minute capacity, I think it was, to 35. In 2012, the VWD increased the capacity fees and the rate of serve fees to accommodate the added capacity. That came to, I think, about $6 a month in the ready to serve fees for new homes. Later, that was changed and the capacity fees went back to 500 gallons per day. And there was this big hike in people with 3/4 inch meters to cover the capacity charges. Since then, the cost of service for the most common meter we have, the 5/8, has gone up dramatically, supposedly to cover this capacity. So they're paying for capacity they don't use. Vista does not charge 3/4 and 5/8 the same. There's about $8, $9 a month difference in fees. And the 5/8 meters have been charged accelerated rate increases.
So it's
I
not,
don't think that is fair to charge people for services they don't use or need.
so with your time being up, I wanna be able to have staff have a chance to kind of clarify some of that, because I didn't realize, I'm confused by the capacity increases, decreases, and the rates that I got it. Aren't those typically two separate things? Capacity fees and
And the commodity.
the commodity,
Uh,
or even the ready to serve. The
Yeah,
capacity
yeah,
fees that we
capacities
charge
for new development is different
and then the
than
ready to
ready to
serve
serve.
cost
They're completely
based off the
different.
meter side is there. I think the speaker might be.
Yeah, he's conflating two issues, and there's a common driver for them, like fire flow is a common driver for both the impacts on the capacity fee and for the ready to serve. So there's some commonality, but they're not directly related,
Okay.
so.
So does that help that
No,
you're mixing up
because if you
things?
look at an apartment with an 8-inch meter, you charge per inch. And if you go by flow and meter capacity, I mean, pipeline capacity, an apartment pays something like 22 cents a month versus about $6 a month for a home. And
Apartments.
that's just one of those things, and the other things is the lease option. And
So-
whether or not the people who are leasing are paying their fair share of both capacity fees up front.
Which leases are you talking about?
Well, you have the option under 1440 to lease capacity
Oh,
to
lease
those
capacity.
people who use a lot more. But they only pay for the consumption element. They don't pay for the capacity costs those new developments don't pay, excuse me.
Well, again, you're talking about capacity
Yeah, I
versus
think-
existing businesses.
And this gets into Prop 218 because there's a question of equity.
Go back and forth.
And the Forest Hill discussion about phantom meters, the guy who led that defense is the same guy who prosecuted the San Juan Capistrano case. And the question is whether these leased meters are phantom meters.
No, they're not. There's real meters there. The Forest Hills case you mentioned has to do with, they were charging capacity, or charging ready to serve charge for meters that didn't exist.
Yeah.
And that's, we don't do that. We don't have phantom meter charges. We charge for meters that do exist, and we allocate the cost for.
Right, but if the number of meters isn't adequate according to capacity, then the issue comes up. But,
Yeah.
yeah, we'll
We
get
can't- we
into
can't-
all
yeah, we
of
can't-
that,
yeah.
and I like to echo and emphasize, the director's point of view that this is gonna be a long, torturous path.
Cool. Thank you. Moving on to item number 2.
Okay, hopefully the next two items will be relatively quick. They're just kind of updates, status
quick,
updates,
that's
what we're
quick.
doing. Well, we'll see. So the issue has been raised about, did we make the PERS payment yet? And the answer is no, but there, and Wes will explain why we haven't made the payment yet. There's a good explanation, but
We're
we're,
collecting so much.
You can't say
very
you didn't have
close to
time
it.
because you just told us you had all the time in the world.
yeah. So Wes, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll try to keep this quick, cause this is not gonna be exciting, it's gonna be a lot of numbers. I'm sorry, I apologize, you see the sheet right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna be talking about the CalPERS UAL payment, and then we'll talk about OPEB after, Mike's actually got a short presentation on the OPEB funding levels, two separate issues. We've got the retiree medical as OPEB, CalPERS is a retirement pension.
Right.
So items 2 and 3 are wrapped into the same presentation?
Same presentation,
Okay.
but we'll pause between the two.
Okay.
But the
So-
OPEB, just to get a basic understanding going ahead, the OPEB is something that we've paid up
Yep.
to this point.
And we're gonna Mike's
Yeah,
presentation.
stealing his whole presentation.
Huh?
You're stealing his
I worked
presentation.
hours on this.
Oh,
Let's just take,
but
let's
you
just
told
do-
us this in the past.
Let's just do PERS first.
Mike wants to share that again, I guess.
Better to do first.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is all, I'm gonna talk about PERS. So first I'll give you some background, basically talk about the UAL funding policy. That was approved by the board on June 13th.
Unfunded accrued liability. That's what PERS calls your shortfall of funding.
Thank you. You can explain those when you get to it.
I'm going too fast, kidding you.
Too fast for this whole
Feel
thing.
free to ask questions and I'll get into the details.
Okay.
And then I'm gonna talk about the amortization basis, which is what you have in front of you there. That's page 10 of the actuarial evaluation. I'll try to explain those a little bit, but on an overview. I don't wanna go into too much detail because we could be here all day talking about that. After that, I'm gonna talk about our methodology, our analysis we use, how we determine how to apply the payment of the $8 million. We don't just send them a check for $8 million and say, here, thank you very much. There is a lot of analysis that goes
I
into
was
that.
wondering why you needed a PowerPoint to tell us that you didn't mail the check.
Yeah, it takes a PowerPoint to explain it.
So I'm gonna give you a
We couldn't find
PowerPoint
the
to explain
stamps.
why we didn't mail the check yet. One of the reasons was we were waiting for the new valuation to come out, which came out, it was August 31st that it came out. So once it came out, we had to do the analysis, look at this, and go through all this process I'll explain to you in a minute.
September, October, okay.
We're busy and that's a lot, so we'll see.
Oh,
some-
now they're busy.
And
I knew that was gonna come.
Yeah, they're busy on working on that other thing.
Yeah.
Oh, we just
We're
did an
doing
audit
PowerPoints.
too. Anthony can give an audit
Wes,
presentation.
Wes wants to work on Christmas Day.
And finally, I'll talk about the results of our analysis and how we determine which basis to apply the payment to. And then Mike will give a short presentation on the OPEB. So first, the background. This is the UAL funding policy that was approved with the budget by the board on June 13th, 2019. And basically the policy says we'll pay it off over 3 years, with the first payment being in this fiscal year for $8.1 million, $8,054,000. So today we're going to talk about how we're going to apply that payment. So here is the sheet you have in front of you, sort of summarized in Excel. The first thing I want to mention on this sheet, it's a lot. I know it's a lot of numbers, a lot of lines here. There's a repetitive nature to it, though. And first, I want to talk about this 3.6. The reason I'm talking about that is because that's where we applied the $834,000.
That's on my sheet here?
It's not highlighted on your sheet because I actually typed it in here and highlighted it. It will be on the printout of the presentation.
I don't see 3 million on there.
No, and that's what I'm talking about now. So the reason I brought it up is because it's not going to match your sheet, because we applied the $834,000 to it. So if you look at the asset gain or loss for 2016 on your sheet, it's going to be 3.6 plus $834,000. Because we paid them $834,000 and applied it to this base on June 25th, 2019.
Okay.
And that was the amount for the Encina settlement and for the JPIA refund check.
Okay.
So that was applied there, so that amount has gone down now. The next thing that we need to look at is, because we are in the middle of their evaluation period.
Whose evaluation period?
CalPERS.
Wait, we just waited to get something back for them August first,
Correct.
and we got it back.
Right, so now
Now
we're in
there's
the new
another period?
So now we're in the new one. So we're in the fiscal year 2020. They're going to be in 2020. They're going to do 2019. So we're now in the middle of their 2019 valuation period that they're going to send us next August. So since we're in October now, when we make this payment, it won't be applied to the next valuation. It'll be in the one after that. And because of that, we are going to be required to pay this 1.3. And this, we couldn't have changed this. We would have had to pay it before the budget was approved back in the previous fiscal year to make this happen. We would have had to approve it in the 19th.
So that cost us some money not to do that at that time. $1.3 million to be specific.
Oh, no, we would have had to pay an amount of that anyway. That's the required UAL contribution. So it would have been a similar amount. It's gonna go down in 2 years from now when we actually pay this $8 million. But anyway, because we're in the middle of the evaluation period, they're always, if they didn't have to lag like this, it would help us out a lot, but they do because they got a lot of work to do too.
They don't have computers either, do they?
No, not computers. So anyway, we're gonna have to pay the $1.3 million. So we pay that, and it'll bring us to our new balance in 2021, which you can see here. So now we're gonna be looking at this column, and this is how we're gonna determine where we wanna send our payment to. So the first thing we do, okay, so let me give you a brief explanation of what this is, first of all, right? This makes up our unfunded accrued liability with PERS. What happens is every year, when the assumptions they make aren't met exactly, it creates a new liability, and there are a maximum of 4 potential changes to that liability every single year. Here are the 4 that are there: the non-asset gain or loss, asset gain or loss, method change, and assumption change. Just to be brief, let's just say those are all actuarial assumptions, and when they're not met, they create either new liabilities or gains depending on where the market goes.
Okay.
So some of them are positive, some of them are negative, right? Every year, so for example, in 2014, and it started in 2013, that's when the liability actually initially began for the district. And in 2014, for example, there were 3 assumption changes that had variances, so we had 3 liabilities created. One of them was actually a big gain for us. In 2015, there were 2, just a non-asset and asset gain or loss. So some years have 2, some years have 4. It's a maximum of 4 potential changes every year. So you'll see that repetitive. It goes 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. That'll just keep expanding with every year that we are in business, basically, and have a PERS at this until we.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Back to basics here.
Yep.
Ramp up, ramp down.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you get into that, we're gonna have a longer conversation. I can explain it to you if you'd like, and I'm happy to, but it will.
I'll wait till the end. Don't get to go through it again.
To summarize the ramp up, ramp down, what happened was when we first incurred the liability, a lot of agencies and cities said, oh crap, we can't afford that. So PERS said, okay, well, in order to make it more affordable for you, we'll only charge you 20% of what you actually owe for that year.
And we did that?
Everybody did it.
We didn't have a
We were
choice.
forced into it, we had no choice. So by doing that, say you had a mortgage and you paid 20% of your mortgage payment due, the other 80% becomes a new liability for the next year.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what that is in a nutshell.
Wow.
So it's basically built-in negative equity every year. Now the good news is, this is the last year that we'll have a ramp up in our liability. So in 2019, it should happen in 19. I'm not making any promises. It's based on what PERS is saying. It'll be a 20-year no ramp up UAL. So it's like a mortgage payment, 100%. That's the way it's supposed to go next year. That's why we waited for the valuation this time, so we could get the last ramped one, the last liability with built-in negative equity, so that we could look at it and see, do we want to pay these off first, because it might result in the most interest savings to us.
And I'm looking at, well, 2016, 17, I mean, those were good years for the economy. And
Well, I can't say that, but I'm saying.
PERS was still saying you only have to pay 60% of what you owe us?
Yeah, they didn't change the way they ramp it. Every new liability comes in at 20%. The next year you pay 40%, the next year you pay 60%, the next year you pay 80%. So it doesn't actually get to full payment until 5 years later. And every new liability is created that way. So
Crazy.
You'll see some of them are at 80 because they were 2015. Next year they'll be at 100%, and they'll be in this category here of 100% no ramp. These won't be there for 5 years, but it's supposed to be the last year that we have a ramped up percentage. We'll see what happens in the next valuation. I'll show that to you next year as well. So from here, we look at the balances. Now we wanna take our amount of money that we're gonna pay, we apply to the balances. How do we know?
A quick question, and hindsight's always 20/20, but if I have a house and I'm paying my mortgage, and I say, hey, I really can't afford this, and they say, well, you only have to pay 20%, I would,
Bad idea.
in my mind, I would say, this is not a good idea, but what I do is I make that extra 80%, and I put it in a separate fund, because they're gonna come back and sock it to me. So, what you're saying is, by us not paying it, our rates were artificially low
Yes.
for this entire time,
Yes.
because this is money we knew we were gonna have to pay in the future, we weren't collecting anything for it.
We didn't
We
know.
weren't putting it aside.
So we were part of a pool, and they didn't start breaking up these bases until, I wanna say maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and putting in the valuation. Before this, it was nearly impossible to understand what they were doing for this.
It's almost impossible now for me to.
It's
And
difficult.
it's still a lot of work. Anthony and I've been working with actuaries. We've gone through so many interviews with them. We have 3 different actuaries that we call. It's a lot
This
of
whole
work.
thing's gonna collapse. I mean, this is
So-
such a,
Yeah.
and it's not Vallecitos related, when I say that Cal PERS is gonna collapse, I mean, this is craziness.
This is why it's a great idea. This is why it's a great idea that
To
we're
do
paying this off.
401ks?
Because
Oh.
by paying off these ramped up bases and the negative equity built into them, we're avoiding all this extra interest. And you'll see, some of these are, I'm gonna show you in the next slide, some
Right,
of
but
these.
we're only being able to pay them off in the backs of our constituents.
But we're saving them
But
so
they
much money
would've
because
paid
we're
one
gonna-
way or the other.
Oh,
You're
yeah,
right
no,
on
no,
that.
I agree, but had we charged them at the time and put it away separately,
Well, I mean, we weren't.
we didn't know this was gonna come.
So PERS should have known about this long before 2013. They should have known about it back in 2004 or something like that. They didn't find out until 2013 when they said, oh no, look at this, and they had this huge liability, and then they just threw it on everybody. And everyone went, what the heck? So our first one was 2013, and it was $6.2 million just for us as our portion of the pool.
Wow.
Just imagine what the whole pool is. So that's, I mean, I could get into this, we could talk about that all day long, but to keep it brief, what we do from there is we look at each one of the bases, and what I do, what we've done as staff, is we pretend like we're paying off each base, and we have a sheet that we get from PERS called Managing Employer Contributions Spreadsheet. We plug it in and it tells us what the interest savings would be if you paid off that base. So I pay them off one at a time, get the interest savings, and then I look at the interest savings, and you can see here in green, well, for the first one, for example, if you paid off the $6,098,000, you have interest savings of $4.8 million. So from there, I calculate the percentage return on each one, and you can see some of them are returning it's like we're gonna get $630,000 in interest savings on a $363,000 payment. Because of the ramping, because of the 30-year amortization, because of other built-in assumptions, it's almost a 200% return on paying that off. So from there, what we do is we take the highest ones, and I highlighted them in green here so you can see them. And we're going to apply, we have $8 million per the funding policy to apply. I apply to the highest ones first until I get to the $8 million.
Yeah.
Oh, they give you a choice as to where you wanna apply it?
And that's what
Yes.
this whole
Yes.
exercise is about, is trying to figure out where to tell them where to put that $8.1 million. You can't just send them a check for 8.1, you have to tell them which basis do you want it applied towards. So that's what Wes and company have been doing for this couple of months since we got the last
And you have to
actuarial
tell them
report.
that, cause they're not smart enough to figure out you want it against.
Oh,
the
no,
highest
they could figure out, but you may not like the way they put it.
That's what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Right. They may put it the one that benefits them, not that benefits you.
Wow, okay.
And this is working with our actuaries at PERS, and I got the spreadsheet from them. I plugged it in all the bases to get the maximum return on this. And you can see if we pay off the $8 million, we're gonna have $10.4 million in savings just from the $8 million payment. So I think that's huge.
Wow.
That's pretty impressive.
Well, yeah, but I don't know you call them savings though.
Oh, it is.
It is.
It is, but it's not.
You compare it to
It's
your
money-
baseline.
it's money we should've, would've, could've, but didn't know enough to do.
Well, I mean. I don't
No,
wanna
it's a
say-
saving, it's an interest savings.
It's hard to say in a good way, but PERS is the one that made the mistake on this from the beginning.
No,
Not
and
us.
I agree, it's all per swoop on,
Yeah.
but, you know, the bottom line is, had they been getting the correct amount,
Yeah.
we wouldn't be anywhere, so we're not really saving, we're paying what we owe that we should have paid earlier.
If they built their investment return assumptions based on realistic returns.
Right.
we wouldn't be in this boat.
So every year when the
But-
purse sends me a thing saying elect, elect these people, I should really look at that a lot more carefully. Of course, I don't know any of them anyhow, so.
So we've identified the basis that return the most interest savings and maximized our savings through this payment. So the results of this are gonna be, we're gonna pay off these 5 different bases. And I'm also trying to pay off the full base if possible, because you'll see the amount there. That way in the next valuation, when it's actually accounted for, it's now 0. I don't wanna have a portion of a base because then they could increase it, decrease it, say it's a different assumption that changed it or whatever.
Right.
I don't wanna have that happen. I'd
Okay.
rather have the base just disappear completely.
So you're paying
So-
off the entire base?
Whenever possible. I'm limited to the $8,054,000 that I can apply. So for example, on one of them up here, it's, 6.5 million, I'm only applying 291,000. That's the only one that I'm not paying off in this scenario.
See, he ran out of his $8.1 million. He had paid other more beneficial ones first.
Correct.
Okay, I get that, but, so this is $8 million, right?
Yep.
So where else do we owe money that I don't see there?
You're gonna see we owe money up here, 6,098,000.
Oh, it's 78%, 60, 78, okay.
Yeah, so that
okay.
wasn't a higher
I
return,
got you.
so we didn't
I
pay
got
that one
you.
off. That's actually, it's ramped to 100% right now, it's a 30-year amortization, so we have a relatively low straight line payment on that. So right now it's not, there's no negative equity built into it.
Okay.
We're still paying the 7%, but it's not it's only 78% return for
Okay.
us, so.
So Wes mentioned that the board agreed on this 3-year payout. So this is the first year. So next year, we're gonna be doing this exact same thing. We're gonna come back and tell you how much is remaining, and then how do you wanna
Can't you do
Hey.
that now?
Well,
Can't you show us now?
I think,
yeah, but the numbers will
I-
change.
But I
they
think-
will
What
change.
numbers are gonna change? Out of those,
All
are
of them.
they all
Oh,
fixed?
yeah.
Every one of them.
They'll all change with the next valuation.
Yep.
Why will they change?
Investment returns and
Oh, okay,
all
but
sorts
if
of things
investment
outside of our
returns are
control.
good, then they should lessen.
Right. Well,
That's the theory.
If they're better than their assumptions.
Right, or whatever
Yeah.
their assumptions were.
Yeah, good is a relative term, but
Okay.
better than their
Yeah.
assumptions.
Do we know what their assumptions are?
7.
Oh, yes.
7%? Is it down to 7?
7%, and there's a 2.7 inflator in our payroll, plus you have the ramp ups that are changing the amortization. So I couldn't just create one
Not
amortization.
in
I tried.
Okay.
low risk.
The first thing I did was try to create an amortization schedule for each base. It was nearly impossible, so I had to call them and say, look, send me this spreadsheet so I can see what I'm doing here. And how do I get the interest savings? Like, oh, apply it to each one individually. So I'm having to do it to each, I can't just combine it. So yeah, and you'll
You
see.
can share your knowledge to people that don't know this for,
I did with Encina,
yeah?
when they went to pay off the 3 year, that's part of what I did for them.
Wow, very nice,
What are we
very good
getting?
of you.
Yeah.
It's a little something for the
And-
effort.
Well, because it benefited
Yeah.
us too, so.
We get a little taste of that back here? I mean,
We did because they started off, they wanted to, how much, it was like, I can't remember the quantity of the savings, but their initial payment from the district from us that they were requiring was a lot higher than we ended up paying.
Well, that's good. Hey,
So you work with Joe over there?
Yeah,
Employee of the month.
And you told him
Fine.
what's going on?
give that to this guy.
Okay.
And when we talk about UO, we don't say, can we get a little taste of that? That is what we're talking about.
About sewer?
Yeah.
So it is very interesting and we have been working on this a lot, so we really.
No, I don't know if this is something that you knew all along or if this is a catch, but good job. And,
Great job.
I think, from a finance committee standpoint, you could brief us on the coming years, but I wouldn't take the same approach. I mean, you don't have to come to us and say, do you want us to do this? Yes, we want you to do this.
No, this is more of an update of
Yeah.
what we've
Oh,
done
okay.
and try to explain it to you. Like, I could have a whole nother meeting explaining what each one of the bases is and
The
I've
percentages
actually
speak for
gone,
themselves.
and I've done the 3-year payout already and the planned payments in the 5 years, which we've incorporated into the budget, so we've worked through further on this.
Save all that for the cost of service program. So the total $20 million down there, the balance.
So here's what happens, here's a summary of what we're gonna be doing. We'll be paying off these 5 bases, $8 million, saving $10.4 million in interest. And
Wow.
the UAL balance will now be $12.1 million
Check that out.
based on the 2021 forecast.
So if nothing else changed, about a year from now, or actually maybe around budget time, we'll be approaching the finance committee and the board and saying, how much of that $12 million do you wanna pay down in that budget? And still comply with the 3-year payoff. So maybe the board will say, pay half of the half that's remaining,
Or maybe we'll say pay the whole thing.
or they may say, pay the whole thing. But we'll have updated numbers to show you, cause that 12 million will change. We don't know if it'll be up or down, but the one thing I know, it's not gonna be that number right there.
Right. But that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So next next year what you will see is you will see more bases being added down here for 19. So
Yep.
there were 4 for 18. This will extend next year, and you'll see 63019, and there'll be up to 4 bases being added to the liability.
But do you see those 4 bases as owing more?
Now, if you look at this year, for example, they had 363. This is us owing that. Then there's a return, which is the asset. So the market did well. We actually got $740,000, sort of a return against our UAL. The method change, that was them going from 30 years to 20 years. And then you have the assumption change. That can be anything from mortality, number of employees. There's past assumptions that they made that actually didn't meet what they had assumed.
So the biggest thing with that assumption change is their expected return on investment.
is-
So they, over 3 years, they brought down that expected return.
So the
More
assumption
realistic.
change, if we get rid of OPEB,
Right, he's right. So the non-asset one is the one I was talking about. He got that right on the assumption change. So we've been working on this a lot.
I don't like to correct you, 'cause you're wrong.
Hey, I didn't read my notes. It's in here in my notes. Shit,
Yeah.
notes.
is that
Session
outright
planning.
correction or is that just a little?
He actually just dodged it. He didn't say Wes is wrong. This is the correct response. That's what he
It's
said.
very tactful.
You did a good job.
So yeah, so that's the summary of what I wanted to present today. If you don't have any questions, then that concludes my presentation.
Fantastic,
We can move on to
fantastic job with
Yeah, now we're done with the PERS, now we're gonna talk about OPEB.
OPEB. Cut
Well,
OPEB.
hold on, I got one speaker on number 2, so before we technically go to 3. Mike, welcome back for 3 minutes.
Okay. Unequivocally, this is a good idea.
Thanks.
The pensions originally were missold by politicians years ago. It's not a question of mistakes, it's a matter of politics. But there's no getting around the liabilities and increasing liabilities, costs of carrying over an unfunded liability. But we're probably not through the woods yet. We can have one new recession, which is overdue. I haven't heard anyone talk about COLAs and purchasing power floors, which should be kicking in about now on some people and will increase. And if we have cost of living, it can be quite bad. Anything to pay off those debts is going to save us a lot of money. But we're not out of the woods by any means. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to number 3, Michael.
Okay, so I wanted to give you an OPEB funding status. As you know, well, let me get into it first. So OPEB, and I have a definition for that. OPEB is other post-employment benefits. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
So we're talking about,
Thank you for
Taking shots at Wes.
as Wes mentioned though, that it is for the retiree health. So we have our money invested in CERT, which is our trustee. So it's like our bank account. And CERT is the California Employers Retirement Benefit Trust. And we established a trust in March of 2012. I think we seeded it with about $2.5 million at the time.
What did you do before that?
We didn't, I don't know, I wasn't here. I don't think there was
There wasn't
any.
one. Yeah.
OPEB was
Mechanism.
just introduced in 2012.
OPEB was already there. The CERT, where we were putting money aside, was introduced in 2012. OPEB has been there since.
It was like PERS is now. We don't have a trust to pay down our PERS
Right.
today. It was just pay as you go, just like we're doing.
So it was just taken out of the general fund.
Right.
Whatever the amount was, they wrote a check in the general fund.
And it's still that way as of today, and we'll talk about that right now. So this trust was established in 2012. So OPEB is a closed system, meaning any new hires are not eligible for OPEB. So
No
I'm
matter
not
what-
eligible.
No matter what their status.
No matter
I'm
what.
I'm not eligible.
Glenn and I don't get OPEB, so we're cheaper.
You plan out a lot
I
of
would
expenses.
have turned it down anyway. but-
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I'm sure that record.
So right now, there's approximately 76 active employees that are eligible for OPEB, and there's 28 retirees. And when I say retirees, it could be retiree and spouse, or retiree and children. So 28 retirees doesn't mean ex-employees, just 28 people.
So explain to me, retirees, Jim and his wife Ethel have a child, John. Jim and Ethel passed, John's still getting money?
So I don't know the dates, but things changed in certain dates. At one date, we stopped allowing children to be eligible,
Yep.
and I don't know that date. And I think there's only 1 or 2 children at 28 right now. Spouses are eligible, and I think spouses are still eligible right now. So yes, if Jim was the employee and he passed away, his wife is under 65. I don't know the exact. It might be like 2 years. She's eligible for another 2 years. I'd have to double check for you on that.
It's not lifetime.
It's not lifetime. For everybody, it would
Yeah,
end at 65.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
if you retire at 64, you have 1 year of OPEB.
It's a bridge to Medicare is really
Right.
what it was.
Yeah. There's
So-
only 28 people left that are retired, and then we got 76 that are yet to retire, but we'll go
And it
into
could
that.
be 152 if they're all have a spouse. Right?
Yeah.
76
Yeah.
employees, and if they have employee plus one coverage now or employee family coverage right now, their spouse would be eligible.
Wow.
Unless they're over 65.
Unless they're over 65 or some other conditions, if they have other benefits or other, if they're like employed and they have their own medical plan.
Is there an average you can tell us of what we're paying out?
Da-da.
So currently retiree health cost is
Good, he's good.
is approximately $375,000, and right now we are paying that out of our current budget. So we haven't
375,000 to 28 retirees.
to 28
That
retirees,
averages out to
12, 13,000.
Something like that.
I got a computer in my pocket.
yeah, I know.
14,
I'm still-
13,
I'm still- I'm
13,895.
still childbearing years.
13,890.
13,390.
Yeah, okay.
You just need
I
to close
just-
the three.
I have the calculator up here.
Uh-huh.
So,
13,000 per thousand.
so AAL, that stands for actual accrued liability.
Thank you.
So our actual accrued liability
You
is
slammed again.
it's kind of like our UAL for our OPEB, for our retiree. So this is a history of our actual accrued liability. And you might want to ask, why is there that little hump in there? So there's some things that can change. And the AAL, sorry, is the present value of all the future benefits. So the 78 or 74 and 28 or whatever that number was. So it can change based on number of employees and actuarial assumptions, kind of like CalPERS can. So like life expectancy, interest rate, health care costs, things of that nature. That's how this could change. Every 2 years, we're required to get a new valuation. I
Actually
believe?
doing it every year now because of GASB 75.
Okay. So every year we have to get a new valuation.
We say OPEB. Are we basically talking medical?
This
All-
this is strictly medical.
All retiree medical.
That's all OPEB is for
All
us.
it is.
Yes.
That's all this is.
It
yes.
sounds generic, other
Post-employment
post-employment benefits.
benefits.
It's just one thing for us.
That's the only
That's
benefit.
it.
There are no other benefits we're paying out.
Correct. So, I was saying in 2013, I think it was a closed system, so that changed a lot of the number of employees.
Sorry. Yeah. And that confuses me because you have an average of $1,300, $13,000 per employee, and yet our medical benefits are $770.
For employee plus one, isn't it like 12?
It's about
Oh.
40
Okay,
per
so
month,
that's
you're talking
it.
about?
Yeah,
So you're
1,100
saying
per
some are
month.
still pluses and some are not.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a blended.
Right. It's a blended mix.
Okay.
And that 375 may or may not include like a 1% charge for administration. And there's some other small little things in there.
Okay, thank you.
So you have your accrued liability. You also have your balance that we put aside. So I was mentioning that we put aside about $2.5 million back in 2012 when it was established. And you go, oh, great, the market did great. Well, last year, if you remember, the board approved $200,000 a month for 12 months. Was it for a full year? So a lot of this growth is at 2.4 million that we put that we added into here.
Right.
Took a little dive like everything did in December, and then since then we've rebounded quite nicely. So our balance is about $6 million. Let me go back one. Our liability is about 5.4 million. So right now we are super funded.
Oh,
So we're at okay. So the next
Wes
chart.
can use it.
Go.
Wes has got a reason to use it.
The change in investment balance is based on contributions, as I mentioned, the 200,000 we did, and also investment gains and losses. So that's what got us to the 5.9. The OPEB percent funded is where I was saying that we are super funded. We're at 110.7%. So now I'm just going to put all three charts together, and I didn't want to do this at the beginning because it's all, but this is kind of how everything flows through. The green the blue is our percent funded. Oops. the green was how much money we had, and the red was our liability. So just again, showing that right now we are super funded. So the question is, you know, the board asked, when's the time to start drawing down on those funds? My response would be, now's the time to start drawing down on those funds. We hadn't planned to do it until July 1st of next year, starting July 1st, but the numbers are saying that we should start reimbursing ourselves. That it's like 32,000 a month, I believe, that 375,000 that we can get reimbursed. So it's kind of like withdrawing from your health savings account or your 529 plan for college tuition. So that's what brought us here today.
The question I would have is, then would it not be appropriate to put that into PERS funding? Because there again, it's benefiting all of our customers.
So this money, like a 529, can only be used. 529 can only be used
Really
for college
like
tuition. This can
medical.
only be used for healthcare reimbursement. This money. So you can, in one pocket, do one thing, and in another pocket, do another if you so choose. So, for example, we would save $375,000 a year, which then you could say, okay, well now that we have that 375 freed up, let's go and do something else with it.
Would
So-
we still, in addition to drawing down the $375 a year, would we stop the $200,000 a month?
We've already
payment?
stopped
We already
that.
stopped that.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we've already stopped that
That was just for 1 year.
sometime last year.
I think it was June
think drawing
30th
down
of
makes perfect
18
sense.
was the last one.
So I don't know, Glenn, if we need board approval or if we can just go and do this. Do we need?
Yeah, well, I don't know. There's some legal issues. We just want to make sure the committee was aware of this, and then we have to figure out the mechanics of, first of all, stop adding money, which we have. But right now, we continue to budget to pay some of our costs. So in addition to not putting money in the trust, it's time to start taking the money out of the trust.
Well, yeah, because
Agreed.
there's no reason to put more money into it, because that's a high bar, that's it.
Right.
So just to clarify, we're not putting money into it anymore, and we have budgeted to, and actually part of our reserve policy conversation will be to change, because the reserve policy currently states if we have rate stabilization or if we go above our ceiling, we fund OPEB. Now that we're fully funded and we'll be paying out of the trust, we plan to change that language to say fund PERS, or fund OPEB then fund PERS, however we want to reword the policy.
Right.
We have currently budgeted, so in 2021, there is no expense in the budget for paying this because we knew we'd be overfunded and we knew we'd be taking it out of the trust. So basically what we've done by saying we're paying off the UAL in 3 years is we're using this money to pay off, well, I'll say this money, but money that would have been budgeted to pay this expense is now just being paid to PERS. So we're in effect doing what Mike was saying and not paying an expense, we're sending money to PERS to pay down.
So technically for this year, it's a net difference of 575,000, because we stopped at 200 and we're gonna take 375, right?
Well, no, because we stopped at 200 2 years ago.
2018.
Yeah, it
Previous
was June
budget.
30th of 18 is when we stopped it. That's when we fully funded the.
But we did budget for 375 to be paid this year, and that's now October. So between October and June, we will have that sort of savings.
And that 375 is not per month, per year, is not accounted in the budget we just passed recently.
It is.
In
Oh,
the
you guys
current-
just assumed we were gonna do
in the
this?
current year.
No,
budget.
no, no. It's assumed that it's going to be paid
For the whole year.
from our budget, not from
Yeah,
the
so
trust.
now to my same point, so from a budget standpoint, it's a $750,000 change
No.
because we were gonna pay the 375 out of the budget,
Just this year.
and instead, well, for this year, but instead of paying 375, we're gonna add 375.
No, what's going to happen? Technically, accounting wise, we're still going to pay the 375, and then we're going to get reimbursed 375. So it's kind of like paying your, like I said, the 529 plan. You have to pay your college tuition.
I got
I
it.
still have to pay my son's $1,000 a month,
You get
and then I get
reimbursed for it. Yeah,
reimbursed.
okay.
So
it's a net zero
really,
to the budget. Yeah.
Now, is there something, out of curiosity, somebody says we
Well,
have
it's
to
not
put
net
towards.
zero.
no.
Well,
It's
for
a
the
net
next
it's
year.
a net 375
For
plus.
this year, it'll be plus 375.
Yeah.
But for
Next year,
21,
it'll be
22,
it's rate
23 going
stabilization.
forward, it'll be no.
Yeah, I was gonna say, can we use that for water stabilization instead of OPEB? Is that a board's choice as to what to use it for?
It just goes, yeah, it goes.
It goes in
It'll be in
reserves.
reserves and
Yeah.
then look at the
Yeah.
Goes in
levels,
reserves.
ceiling,
Yep.
floor.
And for future years, it was already counted as for reserves. We're talking really, it's going to affect this year's.
That's great.
budget numbers.
Right.
The whole thing, if you look at both these topics, the OPEB and our PERS liability and stuff, and I know a lot of this stuff's was out of the control of previous boards, but there was a lot of reforms that took place over the last 6-7 years, whatever it's been now. Time is flying. That I really think with the team that we have on the finance side and the leadership we have, and then the board's fiscally responsible approach to all of this stuff and the actions that have been taken over the last 5-6 years have put us in what could really be a really negative situation. And a lot of agencies, a lot of government agencies and others they're not in the same position because they didn't take those moves over the last 5 years like we did as a team. And so kudos to everybody involved, but I really think that I don't know. I really a lot of times we only hear negative feedback, and so I think this district. I just can't imagine there being too many districts or agencies or government organizations that are in the same kind of position that we are. So just wanted to throw some positive feedback out there.
Thank you.
The one thing I'm sorry.
Oh, now you're gonna throw.
No. I wanted to kind of caution one thing about this is that I keep track of this monthly, and right now I said we're at 110%. If we find that taking this $32,000 a month out puts us, for some reason, the stock market tanks, I just wanted to caution that we would need to maybe revisit this and say, we're at 80% now, we may want to slow down. And that's something that's my job, my responsibility to track, and I would have to come back.
Yeah, and every year in the budget process, we're gonna be looking at OPEB and PERS and our operating accounts and our reserves and everything, and we'll be giving the board updates on it.
So, and to clarify in the process, we still have to pay the expense, and we're gonna have to pay it in future years. What you do is you pay the expense, and because the PERS is the trust is a separate entity, you pay your expense, and then you submit your claim to the trust, and the trust sends you a check. So that's how that process works. So if at any time we say, okay, we're no longer 100% funded, we basically just keep paying the expense, and we may need to fund the trust to get it back to 100%.
Yeah, Joe.
Is that done yearly?
Yes.
Cool. Well, and eventually,
Great news, Mike. Good job.
and eventually, when all those whatever number of people turn 65, then it's gone for good because of the and this was even before my time, I think, right before I got here, but because of the board's taking action and changing the policy, right? So eventually, and I don't know how many decades it's going to take, but at some point, this will no longer be a problem for our customer.
But it just depends on which side of the fence you're on. If you're one of those employees who was collecting that, are gonna collect that, you're looking at it as a.
Yeah, but they're still
collecting it.
they're still going to get it.
Nobody
Nobody's
lost
losing it.
No,
New
nobody
employees
lost
just didn't
it.
get
No,
it.
new employees.
But they came in and that they agreed upon the salary and benefits that were offered to them.
Oh, I
So
agree.
that
No,
they accepted it, right? I mean,
I
they didn't have to.
I have no problem with that, I'm just saying, different people look at it differently. Depends on what side of the
I think
fence
they
you're
all
on.
looked at it my way.
Of course.
Because there was a lot of it.
Is there another way?
I do, so are we done with this one?
Yeah.
Awesome job.
Speaker.
I have one speaker under public comment. You know that we can't engage you back and forth, and you have 3 minutes.
I just want to emphasize to the board that the selling of this 35 acres or so possibly isn't the best way to utilize the property. It's okay to use it for development as far as I'm concerned, but we should retain ownership and lease the property. This is the probably long-term the best solution for the ratepayers. Now, the Port of San Diego has property, and it chose not to sell it, and they're charging a royalty of 11% on the rents. And that is vastly much more profitable for the government, and we're gonna have to get every bit of money we can, and if we do some major new development, we gotta make sure they got the water and waste treatment capacity. And if there's any shortfalls, this will be one way to address those shortfalls. That's it.